All right, let's touch on one of the most important tools you're going to have inside of this project, and in fact, a number of other projects. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and convert it into a smart object with a quick right click. We'll see that we have the smudge tool, just a moment, the smudge tool, not the stand. Right under blur, here we go, the smudge tool. So on a smart object, you can't do the smudge tool. It will complain and fail out. So you end up being stuck in a circumstance where you need to just duplicate the layer, and then you come in and you do your adjustments on the layer. It takes forever to do these calculations, but eventually you get smudges. Kind of lame. So instead, what you can do, and you can do this on standard layers as well, but smart objects, is the Liquefy tool. And that's stashed right up under Filter, Liquefy. And this is a little big for my screen. Gosh, let me shrink that down. Here we have the Liquefy tool. Now, this has a number of options, and it has some great abilities also if you want to do some wacky stuff with faces. But essentially, this uses a grid to perform warps upon things in a manner similar to a smudge tool. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to show the mesh. And oops, that should be stashed right under View Options. Here we are, Show Mesh. The mesh is what's going to change when you move things around, and then it will try to move the image in accordance to that. So let me turn this off for a second and show a couple of tools. We have the Forward Warp tool. Let me just pop this up a little bit. Now, the forward warp tool is dependent on motion, and what I mean by that is if you paint upward, it's going to supposedly push left. Let's see if that is still the case. No, it is not. Excellent. So the forward warp tool, that's wonderful. Sorry, I was thinking of the push left tool. So the push left tool, it's even labeled, and I forgot, is dependent on motion. If you move up, it pushes left. If you move down, it pulls right. If you move left, it pulls down. If you move right, it pushes up. So kind of zany, but there you go. Now, the forward warp tool simply moves things like the smudge tool. So we can push and pull things how we want. Now, that said, our brush is a little more limited than it would be on the smudge tool. We have some brush tool options, such as our size, and I've made that far too large. Our pressure, usually a lower pressure works pretty well, because that lets you make some more drastic movements before you start seeing a result, which is quite nice. So you don't accidentally sneeze and wreck it. You have density, which is just how much of an effect you're going to see within the brush icon. Usually I'll work on a higher density just so that I know what's going on. Not quite at 100, like 90 or so. I know a lot of people tend to prefer 50%. So be it. Whatever you're comfortable with, go ahead and use it. You also have something called rate. And you'll notice that, try as you might, nothing will move. That's because the rate is dependent on things that happen over time. So let me grab the Twirl Clockwise tool, for example. I'm just going to use the bracket key to increase the size here. You can see the size increasing. If I click and hold, we'll see this twirling effect occurring. Now I have a rate. If I wanted to go slower, I could do, for example, 43%. And it would more slowly do the warp, which would allow me to do effects according to my own pace. Now, let me show you the mesh so that you can understand what's going on now. See all of the changes? Let me do a warp. The mesh is being spun around, and then it recalculates things according to what the mesh has done. So you usually want to work on a pretty high mesh, such as medium or small, rather than a large one, which will be a bit cruder in its effects. However, there are times that that's not the case. But keep in mind, you have that available. You also have guides, which I'm not going to be using, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. So that's how these warps occur. And you can save them if you have a number of objects you want to perform the exact same warps on, which seems unusual to me. And you can load in those meshes, which is also excellent. But because you have a mesh, you can undo what you've done previously. Let me go ahead and grab that tool. The reconstruct tool will push the mesh back to its original shape. And you can see it just magically moving about. There is also pin edges. Let me show you that one. Let's say we're up at an edge and we're doing a warp. See the transparency that we're getting playing along the edge here? Let's even do this faster with the forward warp tool. You can see that I'm pulling down nothingness. So I don't like that very much. Let me go ahead and use my reconstruct tool and just reconstruct, and that of course is controlled by the rate, so watch out for that. Now let me grab the forward warp tool. I'll pin the edges. That will prevent that transparency, whoa, as I pull off the edge, that will prevent that transparency from showing through. So now we could do something like the twirl clockwise, and maybe increase the rate so we don't sit here forever. And now as I pull, you can see that it will create this effect without pulling in any transparency, which I think is excellent. Now as I go left or right, I can drag this smoky effect along, which is quite fun. Just kind of get on all that. And you can change the direction of the twirl by holding down the Alt key. So standard direction, clockwise, Alt key, counterclockwise. There we go. We can do all these great effects. Now I can revert my apple by, again, simply coming over to the reconstruct tool and kind of pushing this back into place. But what if I don't want to go to that much trouble? What if I just don't want to affect it in the first place? Well, fortunately, we have some masking tools. The freeze mask tool allows me to come in and do a quick painting across, a quick painting across the apple. Now you'll notice that I have some level of fuzziness, that's the density. If I hold down the Alt key, I can drag left and right to increase the size, but sadly I cannot increase the density, I'm simply increasing the pressure. If I increase the density, my mistake. Increasing the density will not increase the fuzziness, so we're still trapped with it. I'm thinking of another tool, so please ignore me on that. We do have some fuzziness. So unfortunate, but that's the way that this is going to play out. Let me go ahead and paint that in. There we go. So let's say I missed a spot or two, or I accidentally went over it rather. Well, we have the thaw mask, which is just the eraser on that, and that will allow me to pull away. Now, on the thaw mask, it's a similar amount of fuzziness as the freeze mask, so keep that in mind. So now that we've created a mask around our apple, if we come in with one of our tools, such as the forward warp tool, and drag, you'll notice that, well, the apple itself is not affected. The edges, however, are still being affected because of that softness. So what's a good response to that? What you can do is simply paint beyond the edge of the apple. So let's grab the freeze mask, and we'll simply paint in past the edge of the apple just a little bit. I've gone too far. Time to go in with the thaw mask and just paint that extra bit away. And you can always Control Z, so don't even worry about a couple of mistakes. Control Z will simply undo what you've done before. Here we go. Okay, and we followed the edge better this time. That means I can come in and voila, leave the apple alone as I mess with everything else. So I think that's quite excellent. Now we have a couple of other tools. I've already shown you the push left. We also have the bloat tool. The bloat tool is controlled by the rate. So let's crank up that rate even more. Pressure, of course, also affects things. but not on the bloat tool because it's just array based. So do keep in mind it's going to be one of those two options. Okay, and it just bloats stuff bigger. That's all. That's all it does. You also have the pucker tool, which is the reverse. It pulls things in, and it's possible to slide these around, which I think produces a fun effect. And let's add a little more twirl. Oops, I missed a spot on the apple, so it's doing some upsetting things just with that little amount. Look at that. I can drag it all over the place. So watch out on those. And if you ever hit anything that you don't like at all, you can correct it again by going in with your reconstruct tool, and you can just wipe away the problems. You also have the option of the smooth tool. This works better. It tries to intelligently smooth things out, and that means if you have wrinkles on a sleeve, you can actually run this across it, and it should do its best to figure out what's going on and remove those wrinkles, which is actually pretty amazing. So we end up with some crazy effects pretty quickly using Liquefy. All right, so those are your tools in Liquefy. When we're done, we have some reconstruct options. If we click on reconstruct, we can reconstruct the entire image by a certain amount. And if I remember correctly, freezing should freeze the reconstruction. Let's see if that's still the case. It does. So you can reconstruct everything except for what you freeze if you so choose. All right, let's tell it okay for, oh, well, actually, before we do that, one other thing. You do have masking options, so we can do invert to flip things around. You can see where I missed everything on the apple. You can do mask none to remove all of it. Control Z to put that back. Mask all to mask to it. You can add two selections or subtract two selections as well. None will clear all of that out. Okay, under view options, you also have the ability to show the image or not. I don't know why you wouldn't want to show the image unless you're just playing around with the mesh. I think you generally need to show the image going in. You can set the different mask color, which is something I should have done immediately so that I could have been able to see where I'd missed the apple, and there's the problem spot. Because the apple was red, having red on it made it quite difficult. Show backdrop is the original unedited image. You can either pick a specific layer or show all layers. You can have it in front or behind. And you can do different amounts of opacity. So if you choose not to show image, you can just see the background image, and voila. And there we have it. So if we tell it okay, let me turn off show backdrop. If we tell it okay, since we've affected a smart object, our Liquefy remains. We can load it back in and do changes as we so desire, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. Had we done this as a destructive edit, it would be gone forever and we'd never be able to bring anything back. However, as a smart object, we're able to just keep manipulating things pretty much as for forever. Yeah, I think that's great. All right. That's essentially your Liquefy. Keep in mind you also have blend mode. Since this is a smart object, double clicking on your blend mode option will bring up a small window and allow you to do things like multiply, and it will apply your effect as in a multiply effect, and your opacity, of course, is your fill opacity. So you can pull this back and forth and do interesting things to foregrounds and backgrounds and what have you. You also have your smart filter effect, and always test to see what happens if you apply a separate filter. You can see that it brings everything back up. We tell it okay. And we now have two Liquefies, which is also quite excellent. Older versions of Photoshop would not have allowed that. It would have said, well, you only have the one Liquefy. You're good to go. All right, that's the Liquefy. There are some Liquefy tools for face, which you are not going to use for your abstract art project in all likelihood, but maybe you've drawn a face. So let's take a look at that real quick in the next video.